I can't wait for our next session. Have you ever listened to that sentence from your players? That phrase clearly indicates that our players are strongly connected with our stories. It's great when our sessions end up like that, with everyone at the table super excited about what's to come in our D&D adventures. In the last few years, I've been much interested in understanding what strengthens that connection. Here's one thing that I learned. My players love the freedom of building their characters for many different reasons, but they are more than willing, in fact, eager for DMs to work their characters with them. They sense that their characters' goals and motivations are key for immersive adventures. But how could they tie their characters' backstories to the adventure plots if they don't know what are those plots? That's where the DM can join the conversation and help them shape their characters in such a way that will make them shine. After all, we all want the player characters to be the stars of the show. So let me share with you how I approach my players to do that. The adventure I was working on initially had two plots: the investigation of the Ortega family's brutal murder and corrupt officers in the background who were apparently doing what they could to cover it up. My players built their characters for that adventure with very different approaches. After all, everyone has different priorities when creating a character. Some of them were much more focused on their characters' personalities. I think they were envisioning, more than anything else, how they would role-play them. Other players built their characters focused on their backstory, interested above all in creating storytelling elements that they could appeal to during the adventure. And others were much more interested in creating flavorful characters whose stats would reflect an unexpected and appealing design. That was the case of Swain Dandelion. I loved her name so much. A TABAXI monk of the Way of the Four Elements. Of course, a cat monk. Acrobats from the Cirque du Soleil would envy her. She would fight with her claws and harness the power of elemental forces to activate her ki. What a lovely character. In my experience, players who build their characters thinking first and foremost on their personality or role-playing, as well as players who favor design and flavor, are both very open to me suggesting additional backstories for their characters. I strive, of course, to make that in an organic way for what they're thinking for their characters. After all, I don't want them to feel that I'm trying to impose what their character stories should be. It's quite the opposite. I'm trying to create opportunities for their characters to take the main stage of our campaign. That's what I did in this adventure. One of the players was a human warlock of the GENIE. Well, you know, genies are common in a tremendously wealthy merchant's domain in West Faerun. I asked my player what he thought about switching his background to a merchant and adding to his backstory that he was a foreigner from I told him that magic was forbidden in that nation, meaning he would have to keep his pact and powers secret. I added that the ORTEGAS, the family who had been murdered, were originally from and that they could have been their beloved cousins who had migrated when he was still a child. He loved all that. While he had a well-established personality for his character, his backstory was quite generic. He thought this additional backstory was not only a fit for the character personality he had imagined, but would also add depth and make it even easier for him to roleplay his character. And that would also compel his character into the fray, as he would be directly connected to the main plot. A very similar process happened with Dawa, an ELADRIN fighter battle master. My player had designed her character with a flavor in mind, this elegant fey swordswoman who would teleport near her enemies and use her maneuvers to help her allies and disrupt her enemies. My player had a clear description of her character, what she would wear, her preferred weapons, and her preferred fight styles, but a much simpler backstory. And of course, nothing wrong with that. Her character looked very much alive to me. She was a soldier in her background, and I asked if she would be willing to add that she worked as a guard for the ORTEGAS manor. Her brother would be responsible for the night shift and would have been killed along with the Ortega family. And there we go, one more character right in the eye of the hurricane of our story. What to do when players build characters with a richer backstory focused on storytelling? Hey, that's even better, isn't it? They're handing you adventure plots ready to be plugged into your campaign. In this adventure, that happened with two characters. Yurkash was a shifter ranger who was secretly a werewolf pack member. They would track, find and protect folk recently turned into lycanthropes so that they could teach them how to control their gifts. And then there was also Swaying Dandelion, the TABAXI monk I mentioned previously, who was a necromancer hunter. With them, I went the other way around. Instead of connecting my adventure plots to their characters, I took their backstories and created additional plots for my adventure. And that actually solved a problem. I wanted the Ortega's murder to be a conspiracy involving corrupt officers, but I still didn't know who would be the other killers. A necromancer then, thanks for that. The werewolf tracker was more of a curveball. At first look, it wasn't as obvious how to connect that with my story. But wait, what if the youngest of the Ortega siblings was a natural-born werewolf who had had her first transformation under the stress of the killings assailing her manor? That would make me change and adapt some of the plots I already had, but you know what? It would add a super cool plot twist to my story and make it better. It didn't stop there. These two new plots that I called for my reference, the Stray Werewolf and the Undead Haunting, provided elements I was struggling with in my original plots. Combat encounters. With those new plots, I could bring Undead haunting the Winter City Nights that would bring some fun action for my adventure. I added another encounter in which the characters would acquire magic items to help them confront the necromancer. The party would have an encounter with the werewolf, not to kill, but to capture it, which would bring a nice twist to the combat. I also created for that plot the Blood Moon Hunters, a fanatic cult of Selûne, the deity of the moon, whose goals was to hunt down the werewolf the characters would have to protect. Of course, it could have been different. Some D&D groups prefer to play with characters that have been together for a long time and that share a common backstory. But in my personal experience, that's the exception, not the rule. With all that, I think you can see the benefits of working with multiple plot points. Of course, it increases the complexity of tying them all together or ensuring they all make sense in a campaign or adventure. But the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages, in my opinion. They make the story more intricate and exciting. They pave the way for building up tension and surprising players with a plot twist. They make the job of creating fun combat encounters that make sense in the adventure easier. Above all, they allow me to tie every character's backstory into the adventure plots. And that, for me, is what makes players genuinely connected to the story. That makes the adventure goals their own and fills them with excitement. More often than not, that makes me hear them say, "I can't wait for our next section."